One thing has become very clear in the United States, and really not just in the United States, around the world. There's now a revolt against the expert class, the people in the bureaucratic elite who have graduated from top universities and gone to top-level law schools and gotten their PhDs in political science. I'm not talking about a revolt against the people who spend their lives actually creating new products and services, the scientists who create the Webb telescope or something, or the people who are creating brand new technologies in quantum computing. That's not what the rebellion that you are seeing worldwide right now is against. It's a rebellion against a cadre of folks who tend to believe that they have the capacity and ability, because they have high IQ, to control all the things in the world and make things better on every single front so long as you give them inordinate power to do so. They also tend to believe that they speak for a higher level of morality. And when you combine these two things, an expert class that claims expertise but can't actually deliver, with a morality that runs directly against that of the vast majority of not only Americans, but people globally, what you end up with is a class that is held in disdain by nearly everyone. And that class has been the governing class in the West for solidly 30 years at this point, really since the end of the Cold War. But during the Cold War, the expert class really was not predominant because there was an existential threat on the borders of the West. And so everything was about fighting off that existential threat. And so if experts made recommendations that seemed weird, if they made recommendations that seemed to undercut the ability of the West to fight off the Soviet Union, well, then people would just disregard that. And this is why you got populist revolutions in, for example, the 1980s. This is why you got Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister of Britain. It's why you got Ronald Reagan as President of the United States, because of the failures of the expert class during the 1960s and the 1970s. Well, we have seen a consistent set of failures from the expert class from essentially the fall of the Berlin Wall and on. And then people wonder, why is it that people are so angry? Why are they so angry? Well, the answer is because they feel lied to. They were told that there was a group of people who held a better value system, a system that was based on wisdom, a system that was based on an incisive capacity to see answers to difficult questions. And these people were of one specific type, the people who went to top universities and who did not believe in God, who were secularists. They didn't believe in all of these old, weird ideas about how you ought to live your life in terms of family or in terms of sexual behavior. They didn't believe in any of that stuff. They were here to free you so that you would be personally liberated. And then you would be able to just count on them to take care of all of your problems on the foreign policy, economic, environmental sphere. And it turns out all of that was a lie. And you're starting to see that break out into the open right now. So one of the big questions that Democrats have been asking themselves in the United States, for example, right now is, why are you seeing a major shift among minority voters toward the Republican Party? There's a good piece by David French over at The Dispatch all about this over the weekend. And it really is telling, because what the elite class has done is not just blown it in terms of claiming expertise. It's they've linked their own expertise with a certain way of seeing the world, with a worldview. That worldview is secular in orientation. It does not believe in religious values. It doesn't believe that there are such a thing as traditional values passed down over the course of generations that ought to be upheld, because they're just so smart. They're rationalists who can rationalize their way into any bad idea on any front, but claim that they are morally superior to you. So the same people who are claiming that they can run the world economy and they'll run it beautifully are adding pronouns to their bios. The same people who are suggesting that they can handle the illegal immigration problem in a sophisticated and nuanced way. Those are the same people who are telling you that your child should be told at the age of 5 that he might be a she. Those things are tied together, and that's a real problem. So here's what David French writes. He says, there's talk of realignment in the air. If you think all the way back to 2012, you might remember a certain phrase, the coalition of the ascendant. This was the Obama coalition, the collection of all of America's growing demographics, from non-white voters to single women. The Romney voters, by contrast, were fading. White, Christian, and married, they were the demographic losers in a population that was becoming more diverse and more secular. Democratic dominance was inevitable. That analysis should have caused us to feel a certain looming dread. Nations that use race or ethnicity as the organizing principle of politics are often quite unstable and quite violent. This is true across the world, and it's true in our own land, too. Systematic racial division and oppression fractured the country once. It's foolish to think it couldn't fracture again, especially when the political class intentionally mobilizes voters to vote as a racial bloc. Optimistic Democrats, says David French, didn't see Donald Trump's victory in 2016 so much as a refutation of the coalition of the ascendant theory as a quirk, as much as a quirk of the Electoral College, and a reminder that Hillary Clinton wasn't Barack Obama. The nation wasn't quite majority-minority yet, and thus the white majority could still win races when identity politics reigned supreme. But 2020 told a different tale. The Democrats got whiter, Republicans got more diverse, and now all the assumptions are scrambled. Donald Trump lost the popular vote by a wider margin than he did in 2016, but he did materially better with Hispanic, Asian, and black voters. In fact, Trump did better than Romney with non-white voters in 2016, and he improved on that showing in 2020. What was once seen as an aberration now looks like a trend. Moreover, there is good reason to believe that Hispanic voters will continue to migrate to the GOP. We talked about this last week. Roy Teixeira had an excellent piece over at his Substack talking about the polling from Echelon Insights showing the gap between the white college-educated Democrats and Hispanic voters in particular. There's one key element of that most of the media will ignore, because there's one thing you're not allowed to say in sophisticated circles, and that is the word God. You're never allowed to talk about that. Now, I'm not right here making the argument for or against biblical values. Obviously, I'm a believer in biblical values. I wear a funny hat to show it every single day. Okay, but that's not the argument I'm making. The argument I'm making is that the vast majority of people across time and across cultures have believed in a higher power, and they believe that their lives ought to be oriented toward trying to divine the purposes of that higher power and then doing the bidding of that higher power. The idea of living a life of religion is not just common in the United States. For most of world history, and indeed today, it is still the most common way that people live across the world. The Democratic Party has separated off from this idea en masse. En masse. So here's what David French points out. He looks at a 2018 Pew Research Center survey on American religious beliefs. And here is what it shows. It shows that non-white Democrats more closely resemble Republicans than white Democrats with regard to their beliefs in God. So 72% of white Republicans believe in God as described by the Bible. Another 22% believe in other higher power or spiritual force, right? So they still believe in God, but they don't actually believe in the Bible, or they sort of believe in the Bible, but they don't believe in it any way literally. Okay, that leaves a grand total of 5% of white Republicans who don't believe in God. 5%. Among non-white Republicans, the numbers are exactly the same. Only 5% don't believe in God or in a higher power. Now, if you look at non-white Democrats, only 5% of non-white Democrats say that they do not believe in God or a higher power. However, 21% of white Democrats say they do not believe in God or a higher power. That is a massive gap. What that means is that non-white Democrats, when it comes to their beliefs in God, look a lot more like white Republicans and non-white Republicans than they do like white Democrats. And what does that mean? That's a proxy, okay? Because belief in God, particularly the first part, belief in God as described in the Bible, right? Put aside belief in another higher power, spiritual force, kind of generic spiritualism that tends to predominate at Reformed synagogues and liberal churches. But the belief in God is described in the Bible. Again, here are the numbers. 72% of white Republicans, yes on belief in God is described in the Bible. 60% of non-white Republicans, same thing. 61% of non-white Democrats also believe in God as described in the Bible, which means that they hold certain views, not just about God, but about the God of the Bible. And the God of the Bible has a pretty traditional view of roles, of gender roles, of marital roles, of family roles, of how life ought to be constructed so as to achieve human happiness. And the white Democrats, only 32%, one half of the percentage of non-white Democrats, 32% of white Democrats only believe in God as described in the Bible. 32%, 3 in 10 versus 6 in 10 non-white Democrats. And that has real ramifications, because these are not just sort of generic questions about how often you go to church or something. What this has to do with is people who believe in traditional religion, they have very similar views, regardless of their politics on economics. They tend to have very similar views about things like, do men exist and do women exist? They tend to have very similar views on, should a child have a mother and a father? And similar views on, should grandparents have a role in a familial system helping deal with the children? Right? All of these basic structures of human life are far more common as an intensely believed mode of life among white Republicans, non-white Republicans, and non-white Democrats than among white Democrats, who are an entire class apart. The non-white, the white Democrats, that group of people, if you say God in a company of white Democrats, that is not a polite word to say. That is a word that alienates people. People start to get very uncomfortable very quickly. And it's not just me saying this. Dean Baquet, the editor of the New York Times, in 2016, he said, when I'm talking to the people who work with me and for me, they don't understand religion. Right? We're supposed to report on religion, but we literally don't understand, because none of us live that way and none of us believe any of that.
I want to make sure that we are much more creative about beats out in the country so that we understand that anger and disconnectedness that people feel. I think I use religion as an example because I was raised Catholic in New Orleans. I think that the New York-based and Washington-based, too, probably, media powerhouses don't quite get religion. We have a fabulous religion writer, but she's all alone. We don't get religion. We don't get the role of religion in people's lives. And I think we can do much, much better. And I think there are things that we can be more creative about to understand.
By the way, you
country.
can hear in the language that he uses there, there's one point where he stumbles. He says, we don't agree. And he stops himself because he knows that sounds really bad. We don't agree with religion, but that's true. And by the polling statistics, it's true. The percentage of people who believe that God is powerful, knowing, and loving, right? The sort of traditional description of God, powerful, knowing, and loving. 67% of white Republicans say all three. 66% of non-white Republicans, all three. 64% of non-white Democrats, all three, powerful, knowing, and loving. 35% of white Democrats agree that God is powerful, knowing, and loving. Okay, so that gap has some really significant ramifications. It means that people in these sort of secular enclaves in Los Angeles and New York and Washington, D.C., white, college-educated, upper-crust people, they don't believe in God. They believe that religion is a net evil, that it creates polarization, that it creates violence, and all this sort of stuff. And then they say to everybody else, we ought to run the system because we're really smart. We went to college and we've created some sort of ersatz social capital through the college and work relationships that we've formed. And by the way, there is a secular church, but the secular church exists in universities. This is why it has a cult-like atmosphere where you have to call out people who have sinned. It is more like a church than it is like a secular university of learning. And this is the same in a lot of these corporate halls in left-wing centers. You're supposed to acknowledge and repeat the words or phrases that are spoken to you on high by the secular cult leader. Right? When it's time for Black Lives Matter, you got to put that black square up. And if you do not, you're in serious trouble. If it's Pride Month, you best put the pride, not even the old gay pride flag, the Pride Progress flag up as an emoji, or you are no longer part of the secular religion. Okay, well, this view of the world is entirely at odds with the vast majority of people all over the globe, as well as the vast majority of people here in the United States right now. And so Democrats can't see this. They think because they're very smart, we're really educated, and we can handle all this. Now, if the deal was, if the sort of tacit deal here was that you could be patronized by these people because they were so good at their jobs, right? They could patronize your values. They could say that you were a bitter clinger clinging to God and guns and religion and xenophobia and all of this, which is exactly what Barack Obama said in 2008. But the subtle deal was, we're here to solve your problems, right? So yeah, we attack your values. Yeah, we think your values are crap. Yeah, we think you're a bunch of benighted backwater flyover country idiots. Yeah, we think all those things, but that's because we fix things. So the trade-off is you're going to have to just deal with the fact that we don't like your values because our values, our secular values, have led us to be so much wiser than you. They've led us to create new priorities that we care about. Like, we understand you don't care about those priorities so much, but we will make your life better in spite of you. This is why the sort of white, secular, upper crust liberal mentality is so paternalistic, right? Everybody else is an idiot, but we are here to solve all of your problems. So on an international level, this actually does create an enormous amount of backlash. On an international level, there are a lot of countries all over the world. I'm talking about Asia, Africa, the Middle East, parts of Eastern Europe, where people look at the secular left of the West and they say, you guys don't get to tell us that our values are bad. Because I'm looking at your values and you guys have extraordinarily high suicidal ideation rates. And half your kids are now identifying as LGBTQ plus minus divided by ampersand. So no, we don't buy into that. But at least you could make the case if they were good at everything else. Or if they were great at everything else. If the elites, sure, they have this crazy value system, but the proof is in the pudding. The value system must be good because they're really good at their jobs, right? Because that cult of expertise, the idea that they are scientifically minded bureaucrats and that science has invaded every aspect of your life. When you talk to people on the secular left, this is what they will say. They'll say, I just follow the science. Everything is science. Everything gets promoted under the rubric of science. And here I'm not talking, again, about people who actually do science. I'm talking about people who are in political science, which is not a field, okay? I majored in poli-sci when I was in college. There's no such thing as political science. There's just politics. There's no such thing as social science. There is just studies. Okay, the idea that this is any way, shape, or form similar to like performing an experiment in a laboratory is just nonsense. It's not true. But you have a bunch of elite people who have decided to hijack the rubric of science. Science is their new god. It's at least what they're going to act in the name of, and then they're going to fix all your problems. So how's it going? Right? That would be the big question. How's it going? So the experts, the bureaucratic experts that are going to take the power away from you, they're going to tell you your culture sucked. They're going to tell you they could restructure the family. They're going to tell you they can indoctrinate your kids into all modes of bizarre gender ideology. They can indoctrinate your kids into the idea that America is really not a particularly special place and that America's racist and all this. They can do this because they're the experts. So if that paid off, at the very least, they'd have to be good at their job. And herein lies the rub. They're really bad at their job. And this is what you're seeing right now. When Joe Biden took office, he came into office pledging that he was going to restore expertise. This was an open campaign pledged by the Democrats. The professionals are back in charge. And then they proceeded to blow it in every way it is possible to blow it. The experts were back in charge, and it turns out they suck at their jobs. And so we are about to get a massive rebellion on both the right and the left, by the way, as we'll discuss in a moment, against this elite class that said, without any shred of humility, that they could reshape moral society, they could reshape your relationship with your own family, they could reshape the values you live by, and they could reshape the economy, foreign policy, the environment, all these things, because they're just so damn smart. Except maybe they're not as smart as they think they are, because no one's as smart as they think they are. It's not that they're stupid. It's that they are under the grave misimpression that the diffuse knowledge of all humanity is somehow less than the knowledge that they have personally, which, by the way, is always false. That is almost in virtually every area, unless you're talking about like an extraordinarily specific area that requires intensive study, like you're a nuclear physicist or something. Diffuse knowledge of how the world works is way larger than the knowledge any one person holds, right? This is a basic F.A. Hayekian principle when it comes to why, for example, free market economics work and centralized economics do not. Because no group at the top of an economy deciding what prices should be and how goods and services should be allocated is going to have as much information as the entire society at large. That's true in nearly everything. But these very smart people, because they're very smart, they think, well, I have more IQ points than that guy and that guy and that guy. That's true. But when you aggregate all the knowledge of those people, it's way more than whatever you think you know. It's way more wisdom than whatever you think you have. How's this for a title? Ben Shapiro Show subscriber destroys like button with clicks and logic. I'd watch that. Make it happen, gang.